Patriots, welcome to the program. Larry Friis behind the microphone here at Freedom's Voice Radio. We're glad you're here with us. We've appreciated the discussion in the last hour. We've got a great guest for you for this hour, and I think you're going to be surprised to hear what he has to say. I want to introduce to you Lawrence J. Fedewa, Ph.D., so I'm going to call him Dr. Larry. Dr. Larry has a career that expands, quite a number of years. And let me give you a little bit of his background and information because you're going to love just exactly what he's done. He was a high school teacher for many years, but he proceeded to get his doctorate. Does that sound familiar? Eventually became a tenured professor and dean of college. He then founded an experimental college for adults and served as its first president. He was recruited by Control Data Corporation to help introduce the very first major computer-assisted education system, and he sold that. And he sold subscriptions also to the Battelle Memorial Institute of Columbus, Ohio. Later, he co-founded an institute for computer programmers and consultants in the Philippines, serving as the ASEAN countries, became an international expert in educational technology, and then headed federal contractor firms for over 20 years. In the meantime, Dr. Fedewa founded the Washington Institute of Technology, participated in joint venture with the National Education Association, along with two joint ventures with the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. He's tried retirement, but you know how that goes. It doesn't necessarily agree with everybody, but in his retirement, it's given him control to do a variety of things of interest. He started a new Washington, D.C. firm specializing in technology transfer, where he now serves as chairman emeritus of the board. He's also a partner in a firm which consults in cybersecurity products and services, developing U.S. government businesses, and assists owners of government contracting companies to prepare exit strategies, working with both buyers and sellers. Some of his clients have included the National Federal Credit Union, the largest credit union in the world, Passfaces Inc., and Syntegrity Network Solutions. Dr. Larry is also a columnist for the Washington Times. Dr. Larry, welcome to the program. How are you?
Well, I'm just fine. We've got a beautiful day here in the Washington area. Although I live on a little farm outside, we raise Arabian horses, so I have a nice day almost every day.
Well, good for you. I lived in a smaller, I'm from Philadelphia, lived in a smaller Utah town for a couple of years where we had horses, pigs, chickens, cats, dogs, and other rodents that we didn't invite to the farm.
Well, we have some of those.
I'm sure you do. Hey, listen, I really appreciate that you were listening over the course of the last hour. I want to kind of get into some of the meat of this and first talk about whether or not people have idealistic views of what's happening in this particular race, or if you think that there is a groundswell of learning and understanding that we just don't know about because the media tries to suppress a good part of what we should know.
Well, I started on this topic I was one of the early ones in the Washington Times, actually, and I did some research and found out that 50 to 60% of all qualified voters do not participate in even in presidential elections, let alone local elections. And I suggested that if anybody could capture and motivate those people to actually vote, they could dominate American politics. And then I did some more research and decided that couldn't be done. And, I think I was wrong. The whole Trump phenomenon, I think, occurred with exactly that group. And unfortunately for a lot of people, the media and the Washington establishment are not in tune with that kind of thinking. And so the polls, for example, I think are very unreliable because they only go on the basis of registered voters, and the key to this coming election is really unregistered or previously unregistered voters. If they show up in numbers, then probably Trump's going to win. If they don't, then we'll be back to business as usual with Hillary Trump. Hillary. Well, but of course, the problem that is also there is that Mr. Trump is not exactly a George Washington, so we have to decide whether we want to keep on going with business as usual, which is Hillary Clinton, and I think she's on a slow walk to the same place that Bernie Sanders was, namely to a socialist democracy like Europe, or we decide to turn over a whole new leaf and vote somebody in who's going to really change things, or at least we hope he will. So that, to me, is where the election stands. I might use another rather farm type of analogy, and that was kind of making the circulation on the internet. It's have you heard the story about the raccoons in the basement?
Have not.
Well, the story goes that a guy went away for vacation for a couple of weeks, and he came home, and he found that his basement was full of raccoons, and they were just everywhere, and they were gnawing on everything, and it was just absolutely intolerable. So he called the city, and they said, well, they can't help. And he called the exterminators, and they said, well, we don't do that sort of thing. But there was a guy down the street who was kind of a rough guy, and he didn't talk too good, and maybe didn't smell too good, and maybe even took a drink or two. But he knew how to get rid of the raccoons. So he decided to, the owner decided to hire him to take care of the raccoons, no matter how he smelled. And that's kind of where we are today in terms of the Washington establishment. We've got a basement full of raccoons, and we
right.
got to get, even if the guy isn't exactly what we would like to have, he at least can get rid of the raccoons because he doesn't owe anybody anything. So that's
I love the analogy, but I want to go back to what you talked about, saying that, trying to find a way to be able to essentially broaden the base. I mean, Karl Rove proved that could happen in the second election of George Bush. He, obviously termed the architect because what he was able to do was create a broader base within the tent of the Republican Party. While he did reach out, the biggest gains were in those voters who were already affiliated, and in being able to reach out to them and get them to vote, it secured the victory for George W. in his second election. I have long contended that, yes, it's important to address the independents and maybe even the Reagan Democrats, but the more important thing to do is to broaden the tent by getting after those that are already affiliated and to bring them to the polling places, which is exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and also the unaffiliated. They're just they're 40 to 50% of the American adult population that don't even vote at all for anybody. And if you can get and those are the people I think that Trump is appealing to. They're the people that haven't gotten they lost their jobs because of NAFTA. They haven't had a raise in income in 20 years. Their schools are falling apart. It's just that they have a very, very desperate type of existence, and the reason they haven't participated in politics is they felt that nobody listened to them anyway. And all of a sudden, along comes this guy that talks like they do, and even when he's being recorded in private, it sounds a little bit like some people most of us know. So this is a guy that says he's going to change it all. He's going to try to bring the companies back to the United States. He's going to I think one of the two biggest things that he's talking about that are going to be significant. One is he is talking about protecting Americans. Some of your callers were worried about the Constitution. The enforcers of the Constitution are ultimately the judges and particularly ultimately the Supreme Court judges. If Hillary gets in there, you've seen what the Roberts Court has done with a number of controversial issues. If she gets in there, instead of being 5-4, it's going to be 8-1. And that would be in favor of a very liberal interpretation of the Constitution. And Trump, in turn, has said that he is going to he's even named conservative prospects for the vacancies in the Supreme Court. And the other thing that he's talking about is repatriating. There's nobody really knows how much, but there's probably $4 to $5 trillion sitting overseas in American companies that will not bring that money home because of the taxes. And if he could bring in even half of that and suddenly put that investment capital to work in this economy, we would take off and we would hit the 4% that he's talking about.
Yeah, you've hit on a number of issues right there as you sort of went through the argument. And I can't help but sort of reiterate this issue that I've been trying to advance to the audience, and that is that we really have to look at the policies and what the promises are versus what the individual, and private or public behaviors are. Because at this point, none of that really matters. It's about who is going to run the country. And when you start to talk about economic prowess and bringing the economy back in the United States, there is a very clear choice between the two. And the repatriation of this money at a 10 or 15% tax rate is one of the things, as you've just said, that really starts this economic engine. If you remember, if the audience remembers back to the days of, a good economic, time in the United States, the growth essentially of GDP runs between 3.8 and 4.2%. And if we're in that realm, then there is jobs, the economy is moving, people feel comfortable, they have prospects for multiple jobs if the economy is running at that rate. So if you bring that money back, the repatriation has so much impact on American manufacturing and reinvestment.
There's no question about that. And
I'm going to have you hold on to your thought as we go to a break. We're listening to Dr. Larry Fedewa, our guest, columnist at the Washington Times, among other things. We'll be right back, folks, after this break. You're listening to Freedom's Voice Radio. Welcome back to the program, Patriots. Hope you're having a great day out there. We're talking to Dr. Larry Fedewa, who is a columnist at the Washington Times, a conservative commentator on social and political news of the day, former businessman and technology executive, as well as a former college president. He lives on an Arabian horse farm near Washington, D.C. Welcome back, Dr. Larry.
Thank you.
We were talking before the break about the injection of capital that comes with the repatriation of money that's overseas and the economic boom that it would bring to the United States. Do you want to sort of take that further?
Yeah, I think that we've got some rather stubborn problems in the current economy beyond just the matter that's really beyond the reach of the federal government per se. But one of those is that we've been talking since probably, I guess, the 1950s about the problem of when automation comes to manufacturing, what happens to all the great union jobs that We look back upon up until about the middle of the 70s that supported an entire generation, a post-war generation of very, very prosperous middle-class workers. And the problem being that once you get automation, then you get a different kind of job that is available. It doesn't mean fewer jobs, but the types of jobs that are required are not jobs that you can just go into as an unskilled worker and emerge 30 years later as a highly skilled worker. You've got to have some more preparation and so on. I think a good example of how to solve that problem is shown on this TV program called the Shark Tank. If in there you see all of the imagination and all of the entrepreneurship that exists in the American public. Many of the proposals that they face on that program are very advanced, and there is just an amazing track record of growth in some of the little businesses that started out at $300,000 in sales and go on Shark Tank and become one of them was $85 million company after a couple of years. It's just unbelievable. Well, that's exactly the kind of motivation that exists in the American people, and that is stifled by the lack of capital and by the lack of motivation to try things new.
And by the increase in the regulatory environment on small
Regulatory
businesses.
environment is killing small business. So
Right.
if we can, I am very optimistic that if we can just take the shackles off and give the fuel to the population that is trying to revolutionize American business, that it can grow and grow and grow. I know that's a little bit blue sky, but
but it's not. And let me sort of offer some support or strength behind that, because for many years I was a consultant to the business industry, and I watched what happened when businesses were able to thrive. It's because they had the right kinds of capital, they had good support behind them, they were able to grow their companies, they were able to innovate and come up with derivative products, they were able to do all of those things that were natural in the progression of a business. But when you have the government step in because of regulations, thanks to Enron and Tyco and others, the accounting regulatory environment for any small business nowadays is so onerous that it costs almost 30 cents for every dollar to comply with the federal government. That's 30% of the energy wasted in any business to keep itself out of trouble with the federal government. If you can get rid of some of the regulatory environment, we have an injection of capital, which also was stymied because of the bank debacles back in 2007, 8, and 9, you all of a sudden allow for this economic engine to churn at a pace that is back to what you and I remember, growing up through our our professional careers. That's what we need to bring back to America. That's part of what I was explaining in the first hour about somewhat of the American dream. It can be there. Shark Tank is proof of how that can happen when there is capital, support, expertise, mentoring, and in this case, the regulatory environment is still on them, but the other things have been let loose in that Shark Tank environment. So I support wholly the premise of what you're saying.
Yeah, and Obamacare says that you can't hire people either.
I ran a little business, and we had the first years of Obamacare. Within that, we started out at $5,600 a month in our health care costs for our employees. The next year it came up for rebid. Obamacare was going into effect, and we went from $5,600 to $15,100. A $10,000 increase, which is a $120,000 increase that we have to cover through some form of either revenue growth or expense cut in order to be able to maintain the policy for the employees. that
And
was too much for that particular business. We couldn't
yeah, and
sustain it.
you didn't because the only option you had really was to cut hours so that you didn't have to pay those medical costs at all.
And
of
that
course,
was a real production problem in the company because you effectively had people working 2 part-time jobs, so when they came to your job, they were tired, overtaxed, and incapable of really performing at their best. And that was a consequence of the Affordable Care Act.
there you go.
So how did we get here? What's the history behind all of this? I mean, how did we get to this place that we're in with American politics right now being what I would call the low level of American politics?
Well, my simplified answer, and it's more complicated than this, but basically, we came out of World War II, and we were the only strong economy in the Western world. In fact, you could even argue that China and Russia were not, even though they weren't in the Western world, they were not productive at all. So we came out of that. We had the only money that was around, and we decided that very quickly, and by 1948, that we were in a struggle with the Soviet Union. So we began what was called the Cold War policies, and that meant that we had no-cost nuclear shield, no-cost policemen all over the world. We had trade policies that were aimed at trying to bolster the economies of all of the other countries, not our own. And we did with this policy. We set an amazing world historical record of being able to outlast the Soviet Union without any war, and that's probably the first time in human history that that's been done. But the fact is, during that period, we kept on going and spending all this money before, even though we were starting to run out of money, and we began in the 80s to really under Lyndon Johnson, I guess you could say, but certainly by the 80s, we were now subsidizing we kept all these no-cost protection policies all over the world, including the fact that our former enemies, like Germany and Japan, had now become the second, third productive economies in the world. They were the richest people in the world, and here we were still keeping them safe from the Soviet Union. Well, then the Soviet Union disappeared, and we still kept doing it. And we just kept doing it until we ran ourselves into a $20 trillion deficit. Now, so along comes a guy like Trump and says, wait a minute, I'm a businessman. I'm going to look at the budget, and there are no sacred cows. They're not NATO, not trade policies, not any of the alliances, the economic alliances that were formed. And then, of course, everybody in the establishment starts jumping all over him. Because why? Because the guys that are in this establishment are, in fact, they know their jobs are at stake. And so I think, the real question of this election is whether we are going to take a hard look at our economy, a hard look at our budget, and a hard look at the rest of the world and our role in the rest of the world, and maybe make some serious changes. So that would be my, as I say, oversimplified explanation.
But it is so full of meaning, because when you start to think about the impact of having, these people that are in that established routine of being subsidized, whether that's through trade agreements, other countries, or whatever the case might be, all of them are threatened with their livelihood because there's a potential that the money is cut off. And so you can see how all of them begin to sort of line up for what really is the establishment, as opposed to, looking at the the budget of the United States honestly and trying to figure out a way to be able to reduce the deficit, which is another economic engine driver that is so desperately needed in the country.
It's called America First.
America First.
And look at Europe. I mean, the people in Europe think that Donald Trump is a clown. And now they're starting to get scared, and they're calling him all kinds of names. They're scared to death, and they should be, because he's going to stop a lot of this subsidy that's been going on since 1948.
Well, and all you need to do is look at Greece as an example. Look at Italy. Germany is starting to have pressure put on them. Great Britain said, I don't necessarily want to be a part of the Union and be forced to also participate in the bailout of the rest of the European Union, and so they ended up in their Brexit. I mean, people are recognizing this in other parts of the country, and the United States has to wake up and say, those are examples of what could potentially come to us if we're not wise.
Absolutely. I got a lot of blowback when in my last column, I described socialism as being a system of government in which government forces companies to give up large portions of their profits for the sake of the public. And boy, the socialists didn't like that at all.
Right.
But, that's the way I see it, and that's where Hillary's going. I mean, if you're going to start giving away college education and more, and she's got a whole slew of welfare programs that she wants to get going.
Right, and there's enough of a deficit that, how are we going to pay for that? It's going to be increased taxes and borrowings. Again, these are not energy efficient modes for the economy to run on. This creates the drag on the system.
Well, it's more than it's even more dangerous than that. The International Monetary Fund has decided that they are going to take their special drawing rights and try to establish them the special drawing rights as a reserve currency for the rest of the world. If America's dollar were not the reserve currency of the world right now, we wouldn't be able to run these deficits. We would be like Greece. And if we now have competition, what is the very first thing the other countries are going to do? They're going to drop the dollar and rush to the IMF special drawing rights. So, and that is imminent. And the key to it is that China, this huge country, China, had about as much voting power in the IMF as Bolivia. So all of a sudden, they decided that they were going to give China the number of voting percentage that was commensurate with their large population, their large economy. And October 1st, that happened. So now China is equal to us in the IMF, and with the Russians and the Chinese and most of Latin America, they are pushing very hard to reestablish or to establish the special drawing rights as a reserve currency. If that happens, then we've got some real serious problems, and we cannot solve problems like that by being nice, charitable people like Obama.
Oh, listen, we have about 2 minutes before the break. I want to bring in a caller, and then we want to talk about some of the other issues, the military and racism and a couple of other topics. Let's get to a caller real quick. Caller, welcome to the program.
What do you say, Larry?
How are you, Rob?
I'm good as gold.
Dr. Larry Fedewa, does he make sense to you or not?
Oh, of course he does. He's nailing it right on the head.
He sure is, isn't he?
These people are here. It's so funny. Here's a buddy of mine who owns a carpet cleaning business, and he uses this subcontractor from Brazil. and the guy comes in and cleans the carpet. And what does he do? He gives me his business card instead of the guy he's been sent in to do the job for. So I get an invoice from my buddy, and then he gives me his own business card. What does that tell you? That's exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
You know how many times I've heard of people here in the state of Utah, here in California, landscapers that have used people from south of the border, and they're in there trying to steal their clients and doing backdoor deals with everybody, undercutting the companies that they work for. This is the real McCoy. And it's kind of funny. The guy asked me if I had any houses for sale. And I looked at him and I said, I was like, you don't have enough money to buy this house. And he looked at me and smiled. And they know what is going on. These foreigners that are coming into this country.
Yeah.
They know that they're going to come in here and it's going to collapse.
Dr. Larry, address the illegal immigration issue for us.
Please.
Well,
the floor is all yours.
Well, I think the extreme vetting concept is probably very appropriate, and it's true that we do really need immigrant talent.
Hold that thought, and we'll come back and address it on the other side of the break, okay? Welcome back to the program, Patriots. Larry Friis here on Freedom's Voice Radio. We have Dr. Larry Fedewa with us. He's a conservative commentator on social and political news of the day, former businessman, technology executive, and college president, and he currently lives on an Arabian horse farm near Washington, D.C., also noted as being an author of more than 100 articles at the Washington Times. Dr. Larry, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much.
We were talking right before the break. I know Rob has one more question, but I want you to answer what we were talking about before with respect to some of the illegal immigration issues and the impact it has on the economy.
Well, I think everybody has similar stories to what Rob was reciting there earlier. But the main thing we have to do about this immigration thing is we just have to have some common sense. There are people that we need in this economy because our birth rate is low, and we have a high-tech, increasingly high-tech economy. So there are people that come here on visas to become students, and they take their doctorates and they get into research and so on. These are people that we really need, and we want to be sure, of course, that they're committed to our system, and that's where this vetting process that Trump is talking about takes place even for them. Secondly, though, the people that do come on these visas, they have to be monitored. The idea that we give a visa for somebody to come here for graduate school, and we never even check on them again for 20 years, and the guy stays here forever without any particular allegiance to the United States, that's crazy. So there does have to be monitoring of the visas, even of the intelligentsia that we're trying to attract. Now, you start talking about the average laborers and the people that are trying to come into the country who will take the lowest paying jobs and will really decrease the market or flood the marketplace for unskilled labor, and thereby really kind of undercut the Native Americans that are in that sort of situation.
Hi.
This has to be controlled. Then the third part really is the terrorists. We've got a lot of an amazingly virulent type of resurgence of Islam in the world today that as going back to the 12th century, or really even going back to the 8th century, when Muhammad himself was leading these kinds of parades. And we just cannot assume that anybody that wants to come to the United States wants to come here because we're such good people or we have such a good system. we have to really try to do some serious vetting. But the other side of that is we've also got an enormous humanitarian problem in the Middle East. We got hundreds of thousands, millions of people that are trying to get out because their homes and their lands are being destroyed by war and by terrorism. The idea is that they don't need or want to come to the United States or to Europe. They really would like to be able to stay at home. So the idea of trying to get some kind of a safe haven in the area, in the Middle Eastern area, is certainly a worthy goal. I'm not so sure exactly how you pull it off when you've got this tension between the Russians and the Americans. But nevertheless, it does need to be addressed, and I think it is part of the solution. So,
yeah, I would agree with that they need to find a place, and that I know we're not the soldiers of the world or the policemen of the world, but we do need to find a way to be able to help them have opportunity in their own lands, because it's so taxing everywhere else on their economies. They can't afford, the hundreds of millions of people that are essentially displaced. I mean, we want to help where we can, but there's only so much capacity.
Yes, and
I got a good suggestion.
What's that,
Would
Rob?
you like to hear it?
Go ahead.
Stay out of their countries. That'd be a great suggestion. Did our founding fathers plan on our navies to sail the seven seas and police all of the seven seas for global commerce? Do you think they planned on that?
Well, the other interesting thing is that the very first engagement of the American Navy was in the Middle East. It was in Libya, if you recall the John Adams administration. So we've been having trouble with these guys for a long time.
I mean, you got to see it for what it is. Here in the United States, we have like this massive population of homelessness now, and all our corporations are getting shipped out of the country as far as manufacturing. We're not mining. We can't mine anymore. We can't produce cars anymore. We can't melt steel. These people have no option, and then they go into depression, they go into drugs, they go into alcohol, they lose their families, lose their lives, lose their houses because they have no basic income. And some of these people don't have the entrepreneur mindset to try to keep going and keep surviving. I mean, this is insane what's going on in this country as far as homelessness. These people are all displaced. We have our own displaced people out of work in our own country. The hell with everybody else. I don't think we should be worried about everybody else. We need to focus about here.
America first.
Thanks, Rob, for the call, by the way. But it's a worldwide problem. I guess that's part of the issue. And not that we want to necessarily focus on that today, because I think we have a lot of other ground to cover. But, it's the issue of illegal immigration in the United States. And so, there is the extreme vetting that's being advanced, and it makes a lot of sense because otherwise we have a lot of low labor that suppresses opportunity within the United States for people to be gainfully employed, which increases other welfare pressures and increases budget pressures at the federal level. So we've got to stem that tide.
Amen.
Now, let's talk about the military for a minute. And then I want to get into maybe the last part of what we're going to talk about, the racism in the United States and the impact that's also having on this election. But the military has been decimated over the last, 7 years. And it's created other issues around the world in terms of our ability to be able to be present or not present, whatever, you might want to call it. But the fact is that our military has a different level of strength than it has had before, and therefore impacts our international ability to be proactive, of a stronger or coming at things with strength. How do we deal with that?
I think the first thing we have to do is get a strategic plan that makes sense, and we may not be able to implement every piece of it at once. But it seems to me that the issue that we had during the Cold War was we were trying to get as much geography as well as government and allies as we could to counterbalance the Soviet Union. Well, theoretically, at least, that is not our problem today. Our problem today, it seems, if I were in charge of trying to develop a policy around this, I would start with the idea that America has to be so strong that nobody is really going to mess with us. And it doesn't mean that we have to have Egypt and Libya and Israel and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq all on our side in any particular combat role or any other way. All we need to do is to have them have their respect and, I must say, their fear. And the key to that fear is really the Navy. People people worry about the strength of our ground forces, which in fact I guess are about the level that they were when Douglas MacArthur was given charge of the United States Army in 1932. He came out to Fort Meade and he found out that the Americans that were training there were using wooden rifles because they didn't have any real rifles. That was the result of the Woodrow Wilson disarmament, and of course we all know where that led to in 1939, 1940. But we don't want to be in that position. But nevertheless, I don't believe that the ground forces are our biggest problem. I would be in favor of a Navy-based Navy and air-based type of American military force that would be of a level that no one would really feel like they wanted to mess with us. The basic reason we won the Cold War was because some people, particularly once it got to Gorbachev, they understood that trying to do a war with us was going to mean the annihilation of their country. So therefore, they decided that they were going to try to work with us and so on. That is still, I think, the operative principle of American military power. It's to protect the United States. Again, America first. I agree with the gentleman that says that we don't have to go and try to take over half of the Middle East. The other aspect of that, by the way, is that the reason for our interest in the Middle East to begin with was because of the source of oil. And today, we have more oil than anybody. And of course, we have an administration that is trying to outlaw fracking and trying to outlaw any kind of fossil fuel development, including coal, and that has to stop. But if somebody gets in power that says we're going to try to maximize America's ability to produce fossil fuels, and not just fossil. I mean, there's no reason not to do nuclear or wind or any other type of renewable energy. But once we get that position, which we're with a hair's breadth right now, if we didn't have a administration that was saying that we can't use 28% of our entire land mass for any kind of oil exploration, then we would be there. We would be the world's dominant producer of oil, of power and energy. And with that position, we don't need the Middle East. And if we don't need the Middle East for any commercial purpose, then why do we have to defend them? And why do we have to get involved at all? So that would be my sort of basic outline of what I would hope that we would do relative to the military.
You know, it's that old adage, peace through strength. and without it, we're in trouble. We're at the end of the program. I just want to remind the audience that we've been talking to Dr. Larry Fedewa, who is a conservative commentator and also a columnist at the Washington Times. Dr. Larry, I hope that you will be a friend of the show and come on with some regularity. We have so many more things to talk about. We didn't get to executive orders or, racism or other elements of things that are important right now in American politics. We'll have to do that next time. Thanks again for being a part of the program today.
You're welcome.